Today video is focused on Predator Badlands 2025, the latest chapter in the Predators franchise. In this discussion, we will take a thoughtful look at the film as a whole rather than breaking it down scene by scene. I will be sharing an overall review of the movie core concept, the direction it takes, and how well that approach works. We will also take talk about the performance, how convincing they feel, and the impact they leave. Along with that, I will touch on the film's box office performance and how audience have responded to it. This is a calm, honest discussion meant to set perspective, not a retelling of the story. The production budget of the Predators Badlands 2025 can be best understood by placing it within the broader context of modern studio filmmaking franchise expectation and the creative direction chosen for this installment. Reports indicate that the film's production budget fall in the range of approximately 100 to 110 million dollars, positioning it as a mid to upper tier studio project rather than an all-out blockbuster designed to rely purely on spectacle. From a franchise perspective, this budget level reflects a deliberate balancing act. Earlier Predator films have historically operated at different cost scales depending on era and ambition. The original Predator 1987 was produced on a comparatively modest budget for its time, while later sequels and crossovers steadily increased cost without always delivering proportional return. After the more contained and critically well received Prey 2022, which demonstrated that a Predator film could succeed creatively without excessive spending, the studio appeared to have chosen a controlled but confident financial approach for Predator Badlands. A significant portion of the production budget was likely allocated to visual effects and creature design as a science fiction action film set largely outside familiar urban or jungle environment. Predators Badlands required extensive world building, alien landscape, futuristic technology, and predator specific visual elements typically demand a blend of practical effect and digital augmentation. While practical effect can reduce long-term costs and add realism, they still involve specialized team material and extended production schedules, all of which contribute to higher baseline expenses. Another key budgetary factor is production design and locations. Even when film are shot in real world environment, transforming them into convincing alien worlds involves significant set dressing, environmental modification, and post production work compared to earth based predator films that rely on existing locations such as jungles or cities. Predators Badlands require more extensive visual transformation. This naturally pushes the budget upward even if the film avoids excessive large-scale destruction sequence. The cast and performance also play a role in shaping the budget, though not necessarily as the dominant cost driver. While the film does not rely on a large ensemble of top tier high salary stars, it does feature established actors whose compensation reflect their experience and market values. In addition, performance capture, prosthetic, and specialized costume for non-human characters increase labor and technical cost. These elements may not be as immediately visible as visual effect, but they are essential to maintaining consistency and credibility within the Predator's universe. The director's approach further informed how the budget was used rather than aiming for constant large scale action. The film appeared to emphasize atmosphere, tension, and character driven moments. This kind of approach can be cost efficient in certain areas, but it does not necessarily mean the overall budget is low. Longer shooting schedules, additional rehearsal time, and detailed staging can offset saving from fewer explosive set pieces. In this scene, the budget reflects not just what is shown on screen but how carefully the film is constructed. It is also important to distinguish between production budget and total investment. The reported figure for Predator's Badlands refer only to the cost of making the film. Marketing, promotions, and distribution are separate expenses that can significantly increase the studio's total financial exposure. For a franchise title release internationally, marketing cost can reasonably add tens of millions of dollars on top of the production budget. This means the film overall financial break-even point is higher than the raw production number might suggest when compared to other contemporary science fiction film. Predator Badland occupies a middle ground. It is notably less expensive than major tentpole releases that exceed $200 million in production cost, but it is also far more expensive than low budget or experimental genre film. This positioning suggests that the studio expected solid theatrical and post theatrical performance but not necessarily record breaking numbers. The budget aligned with the strategy of managing risk while still maintaining the visual and technical standard expected from a long-running franchise. The budget also reflects confidence built on recent franchise momentum. The success of Prey demonstrated that audience remain interested in Predator stories when they are presented with a clear creative visions. Badland build on that confidence by expanding the scope slightly but without committing to the extreme spending level that have troubled other legacy franchises. In financial terms, this suggests a mere expansion rather than an aggressive escalation. From an analytical standpoint, the production budget of Predator Badlands can be seen as a test of sustainability for the franchise. A budget in the 100s to $110 million range requires strong but not extraordinary box office performance to be considered successful, especially when combined with digital scale, streaming deal, and home media revenue. This level allows the studio to evaluate audience interest in further expanding the Predator universe without exposing itself to excessive financial risk. The production budget of Predator Badlands 2025 reflects a controlled, strategically planned investment rather than an attempt to overwhelm audience through sheer scale. The spending prioritizes world building, visual credibility, and technical execution while avoiding the inflated cost associated with spectacle driven blockbusters. From a neutral analytical perspective, the budget aligned closely with the film's creative goal and the studio's broader approach to managing a long running science fiction franchise in an changing theatrical market. When discussing domestic box office earnings for a film like Predator Badlands 2025, it is useful to separate two different conversations: what those numbers mean for a studio backed franchise release and how the same level of domestic performance would be interrupted if the film was an independent production. Context is essential because box office figures do not carry a single universal meaning across all type of film. Domestic box office refer to revenue earned within the United States and Canada. For industry analysis, this figure is often threatened as a key indicator of audience interest, marketing effectiveness, and long term availability in theaters. However, the importance of domestic earning changes significantly depending on a film's budget, distribution scale, and financial expectation. For a franchise title like Predator, Badlands, domestic earnings are usually evaluated against a highly benchmark studio films with production budget around the $100 million range typically need strong domestic opening to signal commercial health, even if international market and post theatrical revenue will eventually make up a large portion of total income. In this context, a domestic gross that appear moderate on paper may still be considered or underwhelming if it does not align with franchise history or studio projections. Now, if we take similar domestic box office number and apply them to an India films, the interruption changes entirely. Independent films generally operate with far similar production budget, smaller production budget. Sorry for wrong pronunciation. Often ranging from under $1 million to $15 million, with some higher end India projects reaching 20 to $30 million. Marketing budgets are also much lower and release tend to be limited rather than nationwide. Because of this, domestic box office earning that might seem modest for a studio release and can represent a major success for an India films. A domestic gross in the range that might be considered as soft or average for a studio genre film would likely be viewed as exceptional for an India production. Even earning back the production budget domestically is often enough to classify an India films as financially successful. In many cases, India films do not need to rely on international market at all to suggest their existence. Domestic box office is particularly meaningful for indie films because it directly reflects core audience engagement, unlike studio films which are heavily supported by international distribution networks, merchandising, and streaming deals. India films depend more heavily on word of mouth, critical reception, and sustained theatrical attendance. A steady domestic run, even without explosive opening number, can significantly boost an India film profile and long-term revenue. Another important factor is theatrical scale. India films are often released in a limited number of theaters and expand gradually if demand grows. This means that pre-theater average are often more important than raw totals. A relatively small domestic gross achieved through limited screen can indicate strong audience interest, which may lead to expanded distribution, additional market, or stronger negotiating power with the streaming platform. Studio film, by contrast, usually open wide, making their domestic totals more dependent on opening weekend performance. When comparing domestic box office number, it is also important to consider financial risk. Studio backed film carry high risk because of their large upfront investment. A domestic performance that fail to meet expectation can affect future franchise planning, marketing strategy, and even studio leadership decision. India films operating with lower budget face less absolute financial risk, meaning that smaller domestic return can still represent a positive outcome. Domestic earning also influence industry perception differently. For India, films a solid domestic box office performance can elevate the director, cast, and production company, opening door to larger project and broader distribution opportunities. Festival critics and award bodies often pay close attention to India films that perform well domestically, seeing box office success as evidence of cultural relevance. Studio film, on the other hand, are judged more strictly on profitability and scalability rather than artistic or cultural impact alone. It is also worth noting that India films tend to benefit more proportionally from ancillary market of after a successful domestic run. Strong domestic box office number can significantly improve revenue from digital rental, streaming license, physical media, and television sales. While studio films earn more overall from these markets, the relative boost for an India film can be transformative, sometimes doubling or tripling its total lifetime revenue. Foreign India films were to achieve domestic box office earning comparable to mid-performing studio generally, it would likely be considered a breakout success. Such performance would suggest that the film connected with audience beyond its initial niche and demonstrated commercially viability in a competitive theatrical environment. Box office domestic earning must always be interrupted in relation to a film's scale and intent number that may appear modest or disappointing. For a franchise release like Predator's Badlands would carry a very different meaning for an India films. For independent productions, strong domestic earning often signals sustainability, creative validation, and future opportunity rather than short term profit alone. This contrast highlights why box office analysis is less about raw figures and more about understanding the economic framework in which our films operate. When discussing domestic box office earning for films like Predators, Badland 2025, it is important to separate two distinct perspectives. One is how these numbers are judged for a studio backed franchise release, and the other is how the same level of domestic performance would be interpreted if the film were an independent production. This in distinction matter because box office figures do not carry a universal meaning across different production model. Domestic box office refer to revenue generated within the United States and Canada. In industry analysis, this figure is often used as an early indicator of audience interest, marketing effectiveness, and a film potential longevity in theaters. However, the weight given to domestic earnings changes significantly depending on factors such as production budget, release scale, and financial expectation. For a franchise title like this, domestic earnings are measured against relatively high benchmark of this movie. Studio films with production budget around $100 million range are generally expected to deliver strong domestic opening, even though international market and post theatrical revenue stream play a major role in overall profitability. Domestic performance still serve as a key signal of commercial momentum. Our domestic gross that appear moderate on paper may still be viewed as underperforming if does not align with franchise history or studio projection. When similar domestic box office figures are applied to an independent film, the interpretation changes considerably. Independent film typically generate with much smaller production budget, often ranging from under 1 million to around $15 million, with higher end India projects occasionally reaching 20 to $30 million range. Marketing budget are also significantly lower and release are usually limited rather than nationwide. Because of these constraints, domestic box office earnings that might seem modest for a studio release can represent a major financial and strategic success for an Indian films. In many cases, India films that earn back its production budget domestically is already consider profitability, unlike studio films. Independent production often do not need substantial international revenue to justify their existence. A long domestic performance alone can be enough to secure financial stability and future opportunities. Domestic box office figures are especially meaningful for India films because they directly reflect core audience engagement. Without the support of massive global distribution network or extensive franchise branding, India films rely heavily on word of mouth, critical reception, and sustained theatrical attendance. A steady domestic run, even without a large opening weekend, can significantly enhance an India film visibility and long term revenue potential. The scale of theatrical release also play a critical role in interpretation. India films are often released in a limited number of theaters and expand gradually if demand increase. As a result, pre-theater averages are frequently more important than total gross. A relatively small domestic total achieved through limited screen can indicate strong audience interest, potentially leading to wider distribution. Additional market or more favorable streaming and licensing deals. Studio films, by contrast, usually open wide, making their domestic performance heavily dependent on opening weekend result. Financial risks further separate the two models. Studio back film involve large upfront investment, which mean underperforming domestically can have broader implication for franchise planning, marketing strategies, and future installment. Indian films face lower absolute financial reach due to their smaller budget, allowing even modest domestic return to be viewed as positive outcome. Domestic earning also shape industry perception differently. For independent films, strong domestic performance can elevate the careers of directors, writers, and actors, opening door to larger projects and increased recognition. Festival critics and audience body award bodies often take notice of Indian India films that perform well domestically, viewing box office success as a sign of cultural relevance. Studio films, on the other hand, are elevated more strictly on profitability, scalability, and long term franchise value. Domestically, and additionally, India films tend to benefit more proportionality from ancillary market following a successful domestic run. Solid domestic box office number can significantly improve revenue from market, digital rental, streaming license, physical media, television deal, while studio films generate larger absolute earning in these markets. The relative impact on an Indian film's total revenue can be transformative. In practical terms, if an independent film were to achieve domestic box office earning comparable to a mid-performing studio genre release, it would likely be considered a breakout success. Such performance would indicate that the film reached beyond its initial niche and demonstrated genuine commercial appeal in a competitive theatrical landscape. Domestic box office earning must always be interpreted in relation to a film's scale, budget, and intent. Figures that may appear modest or disappointing for a franchise release like this movie can represent sustainability, validation, and future opportunity for an indie film production. This contrast highlight why box office analysis is not simply about raw numbers but about understanding the economic framework in which a film operates. Worldwide gross refer to the total theatrical revenue a film earns across all markets, combining its domestic box office United States and Canada with its international box office all other territories. In industry terms, this figure is often used as the primary measure of the film's overall theatrical performance, especially for studio back release with global distribution. For an industry standpoint, worldwide gross matter because modern filmmaking is no longer centered on a single market. Most studio films, particularly franchise titles and large-scale genre releases, are financed, marketing, and distributed with a global audience in mind. As a result, success or failure is rarely judged on domestic number alone. A film can underperform domestically but still be considered commercially viable if it performs strongly overseas, and reverse can also be true. One of the reason worldwide gross is so important is cost recovery. Production budget, marketing expense, and distribution cost are often substantial, especially for studio films. Theoretical revenue is split between exhibitors and studios, with studios typically receiving a higher percentage from domestic market and a lower percentage from international market. Even so, the combined total of worldwide earning determine whether a film has a realistic chance of reopening its solar investment through theatrical release alone before considering secondary revenue stream. Worldwide gross also reflect the international appeal of a film. Strong overseas performance indicate that the movie's theme, visual genre, or brand recognition resonate beyond its home market. For franchises like Predator, which rely on established global awareness, international earning are especially significant. In many cases, international box office now account for more than half of a film's total theatrical revenue, making it a critical component of any financial evaluation. Another key reason worldwide gross matter is its role in studio decision making. Studio use this figure to assess the long term value of a profit. Strong worldwide performance can suggest sequels, spin off, or expanded universe plan, even if domestic performance is only moderate. Conversely, weak worldwide number may signal limited growth potential regardless of how the film performs in one specific market. Worldwide gross also help contextualize market specific differences. Certain genres perform better internationally than others. Action, science fiction, and visually driven films often translate well across language and cultural barrier than others. Action, science fiction, and visually driven film often translate well across language and cultural barrier, while dialogue heavy or culturally specific film may rely more on domestic audience evaluating worldwide gross. Allah, gross allows studio to determine whether film strengthen lie and how future release should be positioned geographically. In addition, worldwide box office performance influence a film post theatrical value. Streaming platform, television network, and licensing partner often consider global theatrical performance while negotiating deal. A strong worldwide gross signal proven demand which can increase a film value in secondary market even if those revenue are not reflected directly in box office total. It is also important to understand that worldwide gross is not a direct measure of profit because revenue split vary by region and marketing costs are not included in box office figure. A high worldwide gross does not automatically mean a film is profitable. However, it remains the most standardized and comparable metric available for evaluating theoretical reach and commercial scale across different films and market. Worldwide gross matter because it captures the full theoretical footprint of a film. It reflects global audience reach, inform cost recovery potential, shape studio strategy, and influence a film long-term value beyond theaters. Using industry standard logic, worldwide gross is best understood not as a standalone indicator of profit but as a critical benchmark for measuring a film commercial impact in an increasing global film industry. When discussing opening weekend number, it is important to approach them as an indicator, not a final verdict on a film success. Opening weekend refer to the revenue a movie earns during its first few days in theaters, usually Friday through Sunday. In industry analysis, this period is closely watched because it reflects initial audience interest, the effectiveness of marketing, and how well a film converts awareness into ticket scale. For studio back release, opening weekend performance often carries extra weight. Studios invest heavily in marketing before release, aiming to drive a strong turnout immediately. As a result, opening weekend number are frequently used to gauge whether a film is meeting expectations. A strong opening can create momentum, while a weaker one may prompt adjustment in marketing strategy or theater allocation. However, opening weekend alone does not determine a film overall outcome, especially for titles that rely on long-term audience engagement. Screen count play a central role in how opening weekend numbers should be interpreted. Screen count refer to the number of theaters or individual screen on which a film is playing during its opening weekend. A wide release, often involving several thousand screens, gives a film maximum exposure and naturally increases its potential earning. In this case, a high opening weekend gross is expected and performance is usually evaluated in relation to how many screens were available. Conversely, a lower screen count limit a film's earning potential regardless of demand. If a movie opens on fewer screens, its total opening weekend gross may appear modest. If individual theaters are performing well, that's why industry analysts often look at per screen average alongside total earning. A strong per screen average can indicate healthy audience interest even when overall number are restrained by limited availability. Screen count also reflects studio confidence and exhibitor expectations. Large screen count are typically reversed for film that studio believe can attract broad audience quickly. Smaller or more cautious rollout may indicate a targeted release strategy or uncertainty about demand. Changes in screen count after opening weekend are equally important. An increase suggests positive word of mouth or strong attendance, while a decrease can signal underperformance. Opening weekend number are also influenced by external factors such as competition from other releases, seasonal timing, and audience behavior trend. A moderate opening during a crowded release window may be interpreted differently than the same number achieved during a quieter period. This is another reason why opening weekend performance must be evaluated in context rather than in isolation. In summary, opening weekend number provide an earlier snapshot for a film's theatrical performance, but they gain real meaning only when considered alongside screen count. Today, these factors help explain not just how much a film earned, but how efficiently it uses opportunities available to it. Calm, contextual analysis of these elements offer a more accurate understanding of a film position in the theatrical marketplace. The 2x production cost break even rule is a commonly used industry guideline for estimating when a film is likely to recover its basic financial investment through theatrical release. It is not a strict formula but rather a practical benchmark that help analysts understand the relationship between a movie's production cost and its box office performance. A film is generally expected to earn around twice its production budget at the worldwide box office in order to break enough even. For example, if a film has a production budget of $100 million, the guideline suggests it would need to generate approximately $2 million in worldwide box office revenue to cover its core cost. This estimate exists because the total investment in a film extends beyond the production budget alone. One of the main reasons the 2x rule exists in a theatrical revenue split between studios and exhibitor. Movie theater keep a significant portion of ticket sale, moving meaning the studio does not receive the full box office gross. In domestic market, studio typically receive a higher percentage of ticket revenue, while in international markets, especially in certain regions, the studio share is lower. When worldwide earnings are combined, the studio average tickets often close to half of the total gross. Another factor behind the role is marketing and distribution expenses. While production budget are publicly reported more often, marketing costs are not always disclosed. For wide theatrical release, marketing expenses can be substantial and in some cases approach or exceed half of the production budget. These costs must be recouped alongside production expense, and they are usually paid off the studio's share of box office revenue. The 2x guideline also account for risk management. Studio uses it as a conservative estimate to evaluate whether a project has a reasonable chance of covering its costs through theatrical performance alone. It does not include revenue from secondary markets such as streaming license, digital rental, physical media, or television sale, which can significantly improve a film's long term financial outcome. It is important to understand that the rule is a simplification, not a universal standard. Some films may break even at less than twice their production cost due to low marketing spend, strong domestic revenue split, or favorable distribution deal. Others may require more than double their production budget if marketing costs are high or international revenue dominate the box office mix. The In the industry analysis, the 2x production cost rule is best viewed as a starting point for financial evaluation, not a final studio counting. Used correctly, it helps explain why box office total must be interpreted in relation to budget rather than a standalone number, while avoiding assumption about a film ultimate profitability. When analyzing whether Predator Badlands 2025 recovered its budget through theatrical release alone, it is important to separate headline box office figure from the revenue that actually returned to the studio. The film reportedly earned about around 185 million worldwide combined domestic and international theatrical revenue. On the surface, this total exceeds the reported production budget of approximately $105 million, which might suggest that the film earned back its cost. However, industry standard financial analysis required a more careful interpretation. The key factor is that the box office gross is not the same as studio revenue. Theoretical earnings are shared between exhibitor and distributor, with theater retaining a significant portion of ticket sale while studio typically receive a higher percentage of domestic box office revenue than international revenue. The blended global average often result in the studio receiving roughly half or sometimes less of the reported worldwide gross. This means that from a worldwide gross of about $185 million, the amount returning to the studio would be substantially lower than the headline figure. In addition, the production budget does not represent the film total investment. Marketing and distribution costs are separate and not included in the reported production number. For a wide studio release tied to a non-franchise, these costs can be considerable. Even conservative estimates suggest that marketing and distribution spend can add tens of millions of dollars to the overall cost that must be recoupled. These expenses are typically covered from the studio share of box office revenue, further raising the effective break-even point. Using common industry benchmark, analysts often estimate that a film need to earn roughly two times its production budget at the worldwide box office to recover both production and basic marketing cost through theatrical release alone. Applying that logic here would place the approximate theoretical break even range above the film reported worldwide gross. Under this framework, the available box office data does not clearly indicate that the movie fully recovered its total investment from theater alone. That said, theatrical performance represent only one part of a film's financial life cycle. Revenue from digital scale rental, streaming license, television rights, and physical media can significantly alter the long-term financial picture. These revenue streams are not reflecting in theatrical box office total and may contribute meaningfully to overall cost recovery over time. Based strictly on theoretical earning and standard industry counting logic, Predator's Badland appears to have generated box office revenue that exceeds its production budget in raw terms, but likely fell short of fully covering total cost when revenue split and marketing expense are taken into account. These assessments reflect typical studio economics rather than judgment on the film's creative or long-term commercial value. In industry term, underperformance is a financial and analytical classification used to describe when a film's result fall below predefined expectations. It is not an emotional label, nor it is automatically synonymous with failure. Instead, it reflects a gap between projected outcome and actual performance. Measure against benchmark established before. a film release. Expectations are set during the development and distribution phases during using multiple data points. This include production budget, estimated marketing spend, historical performance of similar films, franchise history, genre, trends, release timing, competitive landscape, and audience tracking metrics such awareness and interest. Underperformance occurs when a film does not meet these model projections, even if it generates significant revenue in absolute terms. One of the earliest indicator of potential underperformance in opening weekend performance. Studio forecast opening weekend ranges based on pre-release data. If a film opens below this range, it must be categorized as underperforming relative to initial expectations. This classification can be applied quickly, but it remains provisional. Under longer term, performance becomes clear. Some film recover through strongly weekday hold or word of mouth driven longevity, while other confirmed early signal through steep declines. Underperformance can also be assessed over the course of a film's full theatrical run. In these cases, analysts compare total domestic, international, worldwide gross against projected benchmark. These benchmarks are often expressed as multiple of the production budget or as comparison to previous entries in franchise. If a film's final total do not reach the expected range, it may be classified as an underperformance regardless of whether it technically recoups its production cost. Importantly, underperformance does not necessarily imply a loss. A film can earn more than its production budget and still be considered an underperformer if it failed to cover total cost at the level anticipated by the studio. Total cost include not only production but also marketing, distribution, interest, and overhead. Since theatrical revenue share with exhibitor, the studio's actual return is significantly lower than the reported box office gross. Industry expectations are built around these realities, not just headline figures. The term is also relatively to scale. A $50 million worldwide gross might represent strong performance for a low budget independent film, but underperformance for a wide release studio film with $100 million production budget. Similarly, a result that would be acceptable for an original property might be considered underperforming for a well established franchise with built in audience awareness. This relativity is central to how the term is used internally. Underperformance can apply to specific market rather than overall result. A film may underperform domestically but meet or exceed expectation internationally, or the reverse. Studio often track regional performance separately because different territories have different revenue split, marketing cost, and strategic importance. A shortfall one in one key market can materially affect the film's overall financial profile, even if global total appears solid. The classification also depend on opportunity cost. Studio allocate limited resource, release date, marketing budget, distribution capacity to each project. If a film underperformed, it may be viewed as having delivered a lower return on investment than alternative use of these resources. This perspective is especially relevant for franchise film, where underperformance can influence decision about sequel, spin-off, or creative direction. It is also important to distinguish underperformance from long-term financial outcome. Box office performance is only one phase of a film's revenue life cycle. Home entertainment, streaming license, television scale, and ancillary markets can substantially alter profitability over time. A film that underperforms theoretically may still achieve acceptable or even strong return when all revenue stream are considered. Nevertheless, theoretical underperformance remain a meaningful metric because it reflects a consumer behavior in the highest risk and most visible release window. From an accounting standpoint, underperformance is often used internally rather than publicly. Studio may avoid explicitly labeling a film as an underperformance in marketing or investor communication, opting instead for neutral language. However, with financial modeling, a post-release analysis, the designation help guide future planning, including budget adjustment, release strategy, and risk assessment for similar projects. Underperformance also does not carry implication about creative quality or audience satisfaction. A film can receive positive review or strong audience score while still underperforming financially due to factors such as market saturation, poor release timing, or competition from other titles. The terms strictly relate to financial expectation versus result, not artistic merit. In underperformance in industry term refer to a measurable shortfall relative to predefined financial expectation. It is a comparative context dependent classification shaped by budget, scale, market conditions, and projection established before release. It does not inherently indicate failure, loss, or poor quality, but rather signals that a film delivered lower than anticipated return within the framework used by studio to manage financial risk and evaluate performance. Estimating ticket sale from box office numbers is a common analytical practice in the film industry used to translate revenue figure into audience size. Because box office gross is reported in monetary terms rather than audience, analysts rely on estimation method to understand how many people actually bought tickets. The standard approach being with the average ticket price in the United States and Canada. The average ticket price is published annually by industry organization and reflect a blended figure across formats, regions, and theater. To estimate ticket sale, analysts avoid the reported domestic box office gross by the average ticket price for the relevant year. For example, if a film earns $100 million domestically and the average ticket price is approximately $11, analysts would estimate around 8 million tickets sold. This calculation does not produce an exact count, but it provides a reasonable approximation of audience volume. For international market, the process is more complex. Ticket price varies significantly by country due to differences in income level, currency values, and theater pricing structure. As a result, analysts often use regional averages or weighted estimate when attempting to convert the international box office revenue in ticket sale. In many cases, international ticket estimates are expressed as broader ranges rather than precise measures. Analysts perform these estimates because revenue alone does not fully explain audience behavior. A high box office gross could result from a smaller number of viewers paying higher price for premium formats such as IMAX or large format screen. Conversely, a lower gross might still represent substantial audience reach in market with low ticket price. Estimating ticket sales help normalize these differences and allow for clear comparison. cross films, time periods, and region. Ticket estimate are also useful for historical comparison, adjusting box office number for inflection provide one perspective but estimated audience offer another way to compare modern release and with older film release when ticket prices were much lower. This method help analysts assess changes in movie-going habit over time independent of pricing inflation. From a strategic standpoint, estimated ticket sale informed decision from franchise strength and audience retention. Studio want to know not just how much revenue a film generated but how many people it reached. A franchise installment that sells fewer tickets than its predecessor, even if revenue appears similar due to the high ticket prices, may signal declining audience engagement. This information can influence future budgeting, marketing strategies, and creative decisions. Ticket sale estimate are also relevant for market penetration analysis by comparing estimated attendance to population size or previous genre benchmark. Analysts can assess how widely a film connected with potential viewers. This is especially important for large studio release where success depends on broad appeal rather than niche audience. It is important to note the limitation of this approach. Average ticket prices are approximation and do not account for regional variation, discount pricing, or subscription based ticketing program. As a result, estimated tickets sale should be treated as an analytical tool rather than exact measurement. Despite these limitations, the method remains widely used because it provides insight that raw box office figure alone can't. Analysts estimate ticket sale by converting box office revenue into approximate attendance using average ticket price. They do this to better understand audience size, compare performance across film and eras, and evaluate engagement beyond revenue total. This practice adds context to box office analysis and help translate financial result into cleaner measure of audience reach. Box office performance is most accurately understood as a measure of audience reach, not a direct indicator of a film's quality. In industry analysis, revenue figure are used to estimate how many people choose to see a movie in theater rather than how those viewers judge the film once they saw it. This distinction is central to interpreting box office data correctly. At its core, box office revenue reflects consumer behavior at the point of franchise. It shows how many tickets were sold at what price and in which markets. Factors such as brand recognition, marketing, visibility, release timing, competition, screen availability all influence this decision. None of these elements inherently measure storytelling strength, performance, or artistic merit. As a result, strong box office perform result indicate that a film successfully attracted attention and motivated audience to attend, not that it deliver a superior viewing experience. Audience reach can be estimated by converting box office revenue into approximate ticket sale. This allows analysts to assess how widely a film penetrated the potential audience. A high worldwide gross generally means the film reached a large number of viewers across multiple markets, while a lower gross suggests more limited reach. These outcomes describe sale and exposure rather than evaluative judgment about quality. Box office performance is also shaped by structural advantage, wide release, large marketing budget, franchise familiarity, and premium format availability all increase earning potential. A film released on thousands of screens with extensive promotion has a built-in in advantage in reaching audience regardless of critical or audience reception. Conversely, film with limited release or minimal marketing may achieve strong viewer satisfaction but modest box office total due to restricted access. Industry analysis therefore treat box office result as a measure of market access and demand, not creative success. Quality is assessed through other indications such as audience survey, critical review, repeat viewing behavior, and long term cultural impact. These metrics often diverge from box office outcome, demonstrating that commercial reach and perceived quality are not interchangeable. In practical terms, a film with strong box office performance can be said to have reached a large audience, while a film with weaker box office performance reach fewer viewers. Neither conclusion implies anything defective about the film's artistic value. By separating reach from quality, industry analysis maintain clarity and avoids conflicting financial data with creative assessment. Box office performance play a significant role in shaping perception around the film, even though it does not describe the film itself. In industry and media context, box office number function as signal that influence how a release is discussed, position, and remembered. These perceptions are largely external and are shaped by interpretation rather than by the content of the film. One of the primary way box office performance affect perception is through media framing. Opening weekend result, domestic total, and worldwide grosses are often reported as indicator of success or shortfall. Strong number result, domestic total, and worldwide grosses are often reported as indicator of success or shortfall. Strong number tend to generate narrative of momentum, audience interest, and market validation, while weaker result may lead to more caution or critical framing. These narratives can emerge quickly and persist regardless of how audience or critics evaluate the film itself. Box office performance also influence industry perception. Students, distributor, exhibitor, and investor use box office data to assess risk, demand, and future potential. A film that performs strongly may be viewed as audience of a viable brand or concept, while a lower performing release may prompt reassessment of strategy, scale, or market positioning. These conclusions are tied to financial modeling and resource allocation rather than creative judgment. Public perception is similarly affected. Box office figures are often simplified into labels such as hit, moderate performer, or underperformer. These labels can shape audience expectation for those who have not yet seen the film. In some cases, strong box office performance can encourage additional viewership through perceived popularity, while weaker performance may reduce interest by signaling limited reach, even if the viewing experience itself is well received. Box office results also affect longevity and visibility. Films that perform well are more likely to maintain in theater longer, expand through additional screen, or receive extended premium format run. This increased visibility reinforces the perception of success, treating a feedback loop where performance and perception influence each other. Films with weaker box office result may experience reduced screen count, which can limit exposure and further shape how they are perceived in the market. In award and prestige context, box office performance can subtly influence perception as well. While award bodies do not base decision on revenue, commercial success can affect campaign resources, media attention, and overall visibility during award season. This influence is indirect but meaningful in shaping how a film is positioned within the broader culture conservation. Importantly, these perceptions are context independent. A box office total considered strong for one type of release may be viewed as modest for another. However, once a narrative form, it often overshadows, nonces, reinforces, simplify interpretations that may not reflect the full economic or strategic picture. Box office performance affect how film is perceived by the industry, media, and general public through narrative of success, reach, and market validation. These perception influence discussion, visibility, and strategic discussion decision, but they remain separate from the film creative qualities or audience experience. At its core, the story of Predator Badland revolve around the idea of identity form under pressure and how purpose is constructed when traditional system of meaning no longer offer protection or uncertainty. Rather than centering on spectacle, the narrative framework is built around the tension between role and self, asking what remain when inherited definition of strength, worth, and belonging are stripped away. One of the one of the central abstract ideas explored is survival as a form of evaluation. Survival is not treated merely as a biological instinct but as a process through which values assigned. The word of the film operate on implicit rule that determine who is considered worthy and who is discarded. These rules are not neutral, they are shaped by hierarchy, tradition, and power. The story question whether survival within such a system represents success or merely compliance with a flawed structure. Closely tied to this is the concept of exile as transformation, separation from one's region, whether culture, ideological, or social function as a catalyst for self-definition, removed from familiar standard and expectation. The central figure is forced to confront identity without external validation. The narrative treats isolation not simply as punishment but as a condition that exposes the tension between imposed purpose and self-determined meaning. Another core idea Another core idea is the instability of dominance. Strength in the film's conceptual world is treated as conditional rather than absolute. Power shift depending on environment, context, and adaptability by placing its character in unfamiliar terrain. The story reframed dominance as institutional, not inherent. This destabilization challenges rigid belief system that equates superiority with preeminence, suggesting instead that power is fragile and continuously renegotiated. The story also engages with the ethics of system built on competition, the framework that governs behavior within the film's value conquest and measurable achievement. Yet the narrative subtly interrogates whether such system produce growth or merely repetition. The result of pursuit of status becomes cyclic, driven less by purpose than by fear of erasure. In this sense, the story examines how systems that regard aggression often discourage reflection, reducing identity to performance rather than substances. A key abstract theme is the tension between function and consciousness. Characters are defined by what they are designed or expected to do, but the story questions whether function alone is sufficient to justify existence. Awareness introduces friction. Once a character becomes conscious of their role, that role becomes unstable. The narrative explores how awareness complicates obedience and how consciousness itself can become an act of resistance. The environment of the story reinforces these ideas by functioning as more that a physical setting, it operates as a neutral force that strip away illusion without comfort, familiarity, or symbolic protection. Characters are confronted with themselves rather than with narratives they have inherited. The settings becomes a space where internal hierarchies lost their authority, allowing the story to examine what remain when status is no longer recognized. Another underlying concept is connections formed through necessity rather than ideology. Relationship in the story are not built on sheer values or trust at the outset but on temporary alignment under pressure. This raises questions about whether operation born of survival can evolve into something more meaningful or whether it remains transactional. The narrative does not offer simple answer. Instead of presenting connection as fragile, provisional, and shaped by circumstances. The story also reflects on the cost of proving worth. Validation within a rigid system required continual demonstration, turning existence into an ongoing trial. The pursuit of recognition becomes endless, with failure carrying existential consequence. By focusing on this dynamic, the narrative highlight how system obsessed with ranking and performance ultimately dehumanize or de-individualize those within them. Finally, the core idea underlying the story is redefinition, not the rejection of identity but its reconstruction under new condition. The narrative suggests that identity is not discovered intact but assembled through choice, response, and adaptation. Meaning emerges not from fulfilling an assigned role but from confronting its limitation and deciding what, if anything, is worth preserving. In this movie, this movie is less concerned with conflict as action and more with conflict as philosophical pressure. It uses confrontation to explore how systems shape identity and how survival can both reveal and distort pressure. It uses confrontation to explore how systems shape identity and how survival can both reveal and distort purpose, and how self definition becomes possible only when inherited structure fail. The story core idea lie in this tension because what one is told to be and what one becomes when that instruction no longer holds authority. The central conflict of the film operated at an abstract level as a struggle between imposed order and adoptive selfhood rather than being defined by a single opposing force. The conflict emerged from a system that measures selfhood rather than being defined by a single opposing force. The conflict emerges from a system that measures worth through rigid criteria and a figure placed in opposition to that system simply by existing within it. The tension is not driven by a desire to win, not by the pressure to remain intact while navigating an environment that continuously tests legitimacy. At its foundation, the conflict is about belonging versus evaluation. The word of the film is structured around judgment, where existence is conditional and identity must be constantly reframed within such a framework. Stability is temporary. The conflict arises when the expectation of the system collide with the reality of individual limitation, adaptability, and awareness. This clash creates an ongoing state of friction rather than a single decisive confrontation. Another dimension of the central conflict lies in instinct versus intention. Survival demand reaction speed and compliance with immediate condition, while intention introduces reflection and choice. The film situates its conflict in the space between these forces, acting purely on instinct ensure continuation but strips action of meaning. Acting with intention risks vulnerability. The tension between these modes of existence drive the conflict forward without relying on explicit outcome. The conflict also functions as a challenge to hierarchical certainty. The governing logic of the films would assume that order is natural and justified. However, the circumstances repeatedly expose how fragile that assumption is. When that order is natural and justified, when established hierarchies are placed under strain, the conflict shifts from external opposition to internal knocking. The question becomes less about overcoming another entity and more about whether the hierarchy itself can withstand scrutiny when its rule no longer aligned with lived reality. A key element of this conflict is adaptation. Under constraint, the environment does not negotiate or explain itself, it simplifies, apply pressure. With this context, the conflict is sustained by the need to respond without fully understanding the parameters of success. The lack of clarity intensifies the struggle, turning every decision into a potential risk. This uncertainty transfers the conflict into a continuous process rather than a series of events. There is also a moral layer to the central conflict, center on function versus autonomy. Characters are defined by the rules that predate their presence, rules that dedicate acceptable behavior and acceptable outcome. The conflict emerges when autonomy being to surface with those constrained. Autonomy does not immediately manifest as rebellion. Instead, it appears as hesitation, questioning, and deviation. These subtitle shifts are enough to destabilize a system built on predictability. The conflict further explores isolationist pressure, not absence. Being separated from familiar structure intensifies self awareness rather than diminishing it. Without external reinforcement, internal contraindication become unavoidable. The struggle becomes one of coherence, maintaining a sense of self while external conditions continuously undetermine it. This internalized conflict operates alongside external pressure, reinforcing the film's focus on psychological endurance rather than the overt resolution. Another important aspect is recognition versus reassure. Within the system, to be seen is to be validated, but visibility also invites judgment. The conflict exists in navigating this paradox. Remaining unseen offers safety but risk irrelevance. Being recognized demand performance. The tension between those outcomes sustain the conflict without requiring explicit escalation. The central conflict is also shaped by time and accumulation. Pressure is not applied all at once, but built incrementally. Each response carries residue, altering future conditions. This cumulative weight ensures that the conflict feels persistent rather than episodic. It is not resolved through singular action but shaped through ongoing response. Ultimately, the central conflict is not about defeating an opponent or restoring balance, it is about endurance within contraindication. The film's position conflict as an ongoing negotiation between self definition and systemic demand. The absence of clear resolution reinforces the idea that some conflicts are not meant to be closed, only endure, interrupted, or transformed. By framing conflict in this way, the film shifts focus away from outcome and toward process. The struggle line in maintaining agency within structure that resist it and in navigating pressure without losing harness. This abstract conflict sustains the narrative not through what happened but through what is continuously at stake. The film explored its theme through atmosphere and implication rather than explicit statement, using its narrative framework as a lens to examine broader ideas about power, survival, and identity. These themes are not presented as lesson but as conditions that shape behavior, encouraging interruption rather than conclusion. One of the most prominent themes is power as structure rather than personality. Authority in the film does not rely on speeches, ideology, or emotional justification. Instead, it exists as an impersonal system that operates consistently regardless of individual intention. Power is Power is shown as something embedded in rules, environment, and expectations. This framing removes moral simplicity and shift attention toward how systems persuade themselves without requiring constant enforcement. The theme suggests that power is most effective when it feels inevitable rather than imposed. Connected is the theme of survival as adaptation, not heroism. Survival in the film is not portrayed as triumph or conquest but as continuation process of adjustment. Character persists not by dominating their circumstances but by learning to read them. This approach reframes survival away from spectacle and toward endurance. The film treats survival as morally neutral, neither admirable nor shameful, simply a response to pressure. Another central theme is identity under constraint. The film examines how identity is shaped when choice is limited and behavior is monitored by external force. Identity becomes less about self-expression and more about function. Under such condition, even small deviation take on significance. The theme raises question about how much of identity is intrinsic and how much is constructed through circumstances. It suggests that identity is not static but reactive, constantly reshaped by the demand placed upon it. The theme of hierarchy and legitimacy is also deeply embedded in the film structure. Hierarchies are treated as assumed truth rather than openly defeated position. Their legitimacy comes from reputation and acceptance, not ethical grounding. The film explores what happens when these hierarchies encounter resistance, not through open ethical grounding. The film explores what happens when these hierarchies encounter resistance, not through open rebellion but through inconsistency. When outcomes fail to align with expectation, the authority by the hierarchy begins to erode, revealing its dependence on perception rather than inevitability. The film also engages with violence as communication rather than spectacle. Violence is not framed primarily as action or release but as a language within the system. It conveys status, enforcement, and consequence. This thematic approach strips violence of emotional exaggeration and treat it as a tool of structure. By doing so, the film encourages viewers to consider violence not as an isolated act but as a function of the environment that produces it. Another recurring theme is isolation as amplification. Isolation in the film does not reduce complexity, it intensified it. Without social buffers, internal tension become more pronounced, decisions feel heavier, and consequences feel closer. This theme emphasizes that isolation is not simply physical separation but a condition in which feedback loop narrow, forcing individual to confront their own limitation more directly. The theme of control versus unpredictability play a key role in shaping the film's tension. System within the film attempt to control outcome through the structure and repetition. However, unpredictability persists not at chaos but as variance. This tension highlights the limit of control and the inevitability of uncertainty. The film suggests that system often mistake consistency for stability, overlooking how fragile that consistency becomes when confronted with variables it can't absorb. The film also explored observation and evaluation as force that shape behavior. Being watched carries weight, altering how action are performed and decisions are made. Evaluation becomes a silent pressure influencing outcome without direct intervention. This theme underscores how surveillance and judgment can regulate behavior more effectively than overt force, creating compliance through anticipation rather than reaction. Underlying many of these ideas is the theme of meaning without resolution. The film resists clear moral closure, instead presenting meaning as something provisional. Outcome do not necessarily validate effort or intention. This ambiguity reflects a world view in which significance is not guaranteed by action alone. Meaning emerges through persistence, interpretation, and consequence rather than through victory or defeat. Finally, the film engaged with adaptation as a form of intelligence. Intelligence is not portrayed as planning or dominance but as responsiveness. The ability to read condition, anticipate shift, and adjust behavior becomes the most valuable trait. These themes reframe intelligence away from superiority and towards sensitivity, emphasizing awareness over control. Taken together, these themes from a cohesive exploration of how individual and system interact under pressure. The film does not argue for a single interpretation but instead present a framework in which power, survival, and identity continuously influence one another. Its thematic strength lies in restraint, allowing ideas to surface gradually and remain open to reflection rather than conclusion. The story connects emotionally with viewers not by asking them to identify with specific events, but by placing them inside a familiar emotional condition. Pressure without clarity, rather than relying on overt sentiment or explicit emotional cues, the films build a resonance through sheer psychological experience that transcend the particular of the narrative. Viewers are not invited to feel alongside the character in a conventional sense. Instead, they are encouraged to recognize themselves within the emotional logic of the situation. One of the strongest emotional entry point is the experience of being evaluated without explanation. The story situates its character within a framework where judgment exists, but the role governing that judgment are incomplete. This create an emotional response rooted in uncertainty. Many viewers recognize this feeling from real life situation where expectation or surprise and consequence are real, but the criteria for success remain undefined. The emotional connection formed not through empathy for a specific struggle but through familiarity with the condition itself. The film also connects emotionally through sustained vulnerability rather than momentary shock. Emotional engagement is built gradually through the accumulation of small pressure rather than dramatic peak. This mirrors how stress and fear often operate outside of fiction. Instead of offering emotional release, the story maintains tension, allowing viewers to sit with discomfort. That sustained exposure creates a deeper emotional imprint as it reflects lived experience more closely than sudden emotional extreme. Another key emotional link is the theme of endurance. Without recognition, the story emphasizes persistence in environments that do not reward effort with validation. Viewers who have experienced working, surviving, or coping without acknowledgement may find this deeply resonant. The emotional response comes from seeing endurance treated as meaningful even when it goes unseen. This reframes emotional payoff away from achievement and toward survival itself, which many viewers find quietly affirming. The emotional connection is also strengthened by the story focus on internal negotiation. Rather than externalizing emotion through dialogue or spectacle, the film allows emotion to exist as a process of decision making under constraint. We were also invited to project their own internal conflict into the narrative space. The absence of explicit emotional cues creates room for personal interpretation, making the emotional experience feel individualized rather than prescribed. The story further engages viewers through control, emotional distance by avoiding overt sentimentality. The film prevents emotional manipulation. This restraint encourages viewers to lean in further than be pulled alone. Emotional connection becomes an act of participation requiring attention and reflection. For many viewers, this approach feels more respectful and more authentic, deepening their emotional investment over time. A significant emotional anchor is the exploration of identity under pressure. The story does not ask who the character are in ideal condition, but who they become when notice is narrow. Viewers often relate strongly to narratives that reflect how identity shifts in response to stress, expectation, and limitation. The emotional response arises from recognizing that identity is not always a stable or feel really chosen constraint but something shaped by circumstances. The film also connects emotionally through its treatment of isolation as an emotional amplifier. Isolation in the story heightens self awareness rather than diminishing it. Without external reassurance, doubt and resolve coexist more intensely. Many viewers recognize this emotional state whether from personal loss, professional pressure, or period of uncertainty. The story reflects how isolation can make emotions sharper and more difficult to ignore, creating a strong emotional parallel to real life experience. Another important factor is the theme of unresolved tension. The story does not offer clear emotional closure, and this absence itself becomes emotionally meaningful. Viewers are left to carry the emotional weight beyond the film duration. This mirror real emotional experience which often do not resolve neatly. By resisting emotional finality, the film validates the complexity of unresolved feeling, allowing viewer to feel seen rather than soothed. The emotional connection is also reinforced through moral ambiguity. The story avoids clear distinction between right and wrong, success and failure. This ambiguity reflects the moral uncertainty many people navigate daily. Emotional engagement emerges from recognition rather than alignment. Viewers do not need to agree with every choice to feel connected to the emotional stakes behind those choices. Finally, the story resonates emotionally because it treats attention as respect. It assumes the viewer is capable of emotional interpretation without guidance. This trust fosters a deeper bond between the story and its audience. Rather than instructing viewers on what to feel, the film creates conditions in which feeling emerge naturally. In this way, the emotional connection does not come from spectral resolution or identification with specific outcome. It comes from sheer psychological terrain. The story connect because it reflects how it feels to exist within a system of pressure, uncertainty, and endurance experience that many viewers recognize not as fiction but as reality. The main characters are written less or as traditional protagonist and antagonist and more as functional center of pressure, each embodying a different response to the same hostile framework from a reviewer perspective. What stand out is not how much backstory they are given, but how deliberately that backstory is withheld. The film seemed more interested in how these characters behave under constraint than in explaining who they were before those constraints existed. The central figure is defined primarily by control restraint. This character is not expressive in a conventional sense, and the performance lean heavily on physical presence, timing, and reaction rather than dialogue. What makes the characterization effective is consistency. The character's choice feel gone by an internal logic that prioritizes observation over impulse. In reviewers' terms, this creates a grounded anchor for the audience even when motivation are not verbalizing. The character's behavior remain readable, which allow viewers to project meaning without confusion. The character is not framed as heroic in the traditional sense. There is title emphasize on moral superiority or emotional openness. Instead, the performance suggests competence shaped by necessity. This restraint avoid romanticizing struggle and keep the character aligned with the film's broader tone of endurance rather than triumph. The characters function as a lens through which the environment is interrupted, not as force that reshape it. Character operate as a contrast through adaptability, where the central figure is reversed and measured. This character reflects responsiveness and improvisation. The performance carries a sense of alertness as through constantly recalibrating to changing conditions. From a critical standpoint, this character adds elasticity to the narrative, preventing the film from settling into a single emotional rhythm. Their presence introduces uncertainty not through unpredictability but through flexibility. This character role is particularly effective because it avoids becoming a simple foil rather than opposing the central figure. They highlight alternative survival strategies. The dynamic between them is less about conflict and more about parallel response to the same pressure. In viewers' term, this relationship deepens the film's thematic complexity without relying on overt confrontation. Now we talk about the acting style across the board is deliberately muted. Expression or control, dialogue is economical, and emotional shift are gradual. This approach may feel distant to some viewer, but in viewers' term it aligns cleanly with the film's thematic intention. The characters are not designed to invite attachment through reliability alone, but through recognition of shared psychological state. Overall, the main characters succeed not because they are richly explained, but they are precisely positioned. Each one reflect a different way of exciting within pressure, endurance, adaptation, compliance, and vulnerability. As a viewer, this clarity of function is one of the film's strength, and the characters do not compete for attention. They collectively reinforce the film's central concern, allowing performance and theme to move in parallel rather than in conflict. The acting performance in the film are designed to operate on an emotional frequency that is low, steady, and persistent rather than expressive or dramatic. Instead of drawing attention to themselves, the performance work quietly, allowing emotion to surface through restraint. This approach may feel subdued on the surface, but emotionally it creates a sustained sense of tension that stay with the viewers longer than over display word. Now the lead performance is emotionally effective, specifically because it avoids signaling emotion in obvious way. There is a strong sense of internal control, as through every reaction has been way before being released. Emotion is present, but it exists beneath the surface, communicated through posture, pacing, and stillness. This creates an emotional pull rooted in anticipation rather than release. Viewers are not told what to feel, they sense that something is being held back, and that restraint becomes the emotional core of the Performance. What makes this performance resonate emotionally is its consistency. The character does not fluctuate emotionally to accommodate individual moment. Instead, the emotional state feel continuous, shaped by long-term pressure rather than immediate circumstances. This mirrors how people often experience stress in real life, not as sudden breakdown but as sustained control that slowly accumulate weight. The performance reflects that reality with precision. Sporting performance expand the emotional range without disturbing the film overall tone. One key sporting actor become a more reactive emotional presence marked by alertness and adaptability. Emotion here is expressed through movement and responsiveness rather than introspection. This performance creates emotional contrast, making through movement and responsiveness rather than interception. The performance creates emotional contrast, making the lead restraint feel more emotional. This dynamic work because it reflects different coping mechanism rather than opposing personality. Another performance stand out for its emotional neutrality. This actor deliver line and action with minimal affection, creating an emotional absence that feel intentional. Rather than reading as flat, the performance generate discomfort. Emotionally, this absence function as pressure. The lack of visible feeling become unsettling, reminding the viewers that not all emotional weight come from expression, something it comes from its denial. There is also a performance defined by vulnerability, through it never crosses into sentimentality. Emotions appear briefly, often in hesitation or silence, and then recede. These moments are emotionally impactful because they feel fragile. The performance captures the emotional cost of existing under sustained strain without offering relief for viewer. This creates empathy not through identification but through recognition of emotional fatigue. Across the ensemble, the actors share a commitment to emotional economy. No one performance seek dominance or emotional payoff. Thus, collective restraint create a unified emotional atmosphere where individual emotion feel interconnected rather than isolated. Emotion become environmental rather than personal, something that permeate the film rather than interrupted in moments. The emotional power of these performances also come from what is not shown. The actor frequently allow scene to end without emotional resolution. Reactions are shortcut, expression remain unfinished, and emotional react feel deliberately incomplete. This choice invite viewers to carry emotion forward themselves. Emotion is not consumed within the scene, it lingers. Silence play a critical emotional role in the performance. The actor use poses not as dynamic emphasis but as emotional pace. This silence allow tension to settle and give viewer time to process what is not being said. Emotion emerging these gaps often more strongly than it would through dialogue. The performance must silence as an emotional tool which gives the film a mere reflective emotional rhythm. The film approached realism and actor depth through restraint rather than detail, favoring behavioral authenticity over explanatory context. Instead of constructing realism through extensive backstory or exposition, it allows how character respond to pressure, uncertainty, and limited choice. This method create a grounded sense of reality that feel experiential rather than descriptive, allowing viewer to engage with the character as they exist in the moment rather than as fully documented histories. Realism in the film is rooted in consistency. Character behave in ways that align with their established pattern, even when these patterns limit their option. There is no sense that action or shape for dramatic convenience. The scene appear to rise from immediate condition rather than narrative necessity. This consistency build credibility as a character feel gone by the same constraint across the film, much like people navigating real world system that do not adopt to individual need. Another key aspect of realism is the film avoidance of emotional exaggeration. Character do not articulate their internal state openly, and emotional reactions are often muted. This reflects how people frequently manage emotion in high pressure environment by controlling it rather than expressing it. The absence of emotional release enhance realism as it mirror how stress is often internalized rather than resolved. Viewers are asked to infer emotional state from behavior which align with real life observation. Character depth emerge through accumulation rather than revelation. Depth is not delivered through defining moment or conventional dialogue but through repeated exposure to how character adopt, hesitate or persist. Over time pattern become visible. A character priorities, fears and limit are revealed indirectly, creating a layer understanding that feel earned rather than persistent. Film also use environmental interaction as a tool for a character. Characters are defined by how they move through space, how they respond to obstacle and how they manage limited resources. These interactions serve as extension of personality. A question's movement, a delayed response or a mere action can communicate more about a character's internal state than explicit explanation. This approach in reinforces realism by tying character psychology to physical behavior. Importantly, the film resists simplifying character into archetype. Even when roles appear familiar, the execution avoids predictability. Characters are allowed to be competent without being flawless and vulnerable without being defined by weakness. This balance adds depth by acknowledging contradiction as a natural part of human behavior. People in real life often act rationally and emotionally within the same moment, and the film reflects that complexity. The lack of overt moral framing further support realism. The film does not guide viewer toward clear judgment about character choices. Actions are presented with consequence but without editorial emphasis. This neutrality allows character to exist as individual shaped by circumstances rather than as vehicle for moral messaging. Depth arises from understanding context rather than endorsing behavior.